So having the that, that particular accent tell me something that is being recorded is unnerving always. But welcome to the third class on Heidegger and Plato. Brief poll. I was thinking to make further progress in the essay or go back to the Republic excerpt that I sent round and look at a couple of passages briefly on the ideas. What I do intend on the last meeting that we have is to go through Plato by himself and to offer an independent interpretation, and then on the basis of our discussing Heidegger's essay, to come to some judgment between the two. But I thought it might be helpful, just given the always detailed reading that Heidegger makes. Suggestions? Any suggestions?
I know nothing. So what do you think we need to know? More importantly.
Well, he's making this suggestion that the essence of truth changes and that we see it changing in this essay. And I thought, if that's obscure, as Chris was commenting before, it might be good to have a quick look at something that Plato says about the truth of things.
Yes, can we do that, please?
Okay.
Sorry, that's just my opinion, one person.
You spoke, so therefore, I just have to.
Yeah, it seems sensible. Why not? Yeah.
Okay. And we will go back to Plato again in more detail. But I think it, 3 or 4 times for the noble things, as Xenophon once said. So if you're looking at this independently on paper, it's at 507b following in this text. Just one page back. Is that large enough to be visible?
A bit small.
Sorry.
It's a bit small.
How's that?
Oh, that's beautiful.
Okay, so this at 507A here, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
So if I highlight, okay. The basic context is that, and I'll go into the context in more detail in the 5th class, but the basic context is that they've established a city that is meant to show them what justice is. Not that it may actually come to be, but it shows them what justice is, for which you'll need wise rulers to dispense everything justly to the citizens. So then when they come to the education of the rulers, he then says that there is something still more important than the education in the virtues of justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom. And the people he is talking to are then very keen to learn what this highest wisdom would be. And Socrates keeps going back and forth saying, I'm afraid I can't tell you because I don't have it. I only have opinions about it. Opinions without truth are ugly, and so on. So this is helpful to keep in mind for the whole presentation of these images of the relation between truth and image that Socrates gives, is that he is explicitly saying that the current trajectory of their conversation can't reach the truth. He can only give them opinions, suppositions, and so on. And that's what he's asserting again here at 507A. And then he says, I'll proceed to try and tell you what this ultimate wisdom is if we can come to an agreement and remind you of the things stated earlier in this conversation and repeated often on other occasions. Now, I don't think that means, and he's going to discuss what he means by an idea. the look, the form, the intelligible character of a thing. And I don't think that means that the people he's talking to, whose names are Glaucon, Adeimantus, they haven't been to a lot of graduate seminars on Platonic theory of form, or what he's attempting to suggest is that, sorry, I just have to. Right. What he's suggesting is that this teaching arises out of our ordinary way of experiencing and describing things. And as, for example, he says here at B2, we both assert that there are, Socrates said, and distinguish in speech many beautiful things or noble things, and Bloom's translated it fair things here, many good things, and so on for each kind of thing. So we assert that there are and distinguish in speech, two different acts. And Glaucon is happy to agree. And then he says, and we also assert that there is a fair or a beauty or nobility is something. It is in itself, a good itself, and so on for everything else. And so on for all the things that we set down as many. So we have our experience is that there are these beings which we experience as a many, as a multiplicity, but we can't even refer to them. We can't pick them out and say that's a beautiful painting, that's a noble act, if there's no such thing as nobility. And that he's appealing to that aspect of the experience. Now, again, we refer them to one idea, one look. So they have one look, but to the mind, not to the senses, of each, as though the idea were one, and we address it as that which really is. So if you have a conversation about beauty, you might be referring to human acts, works of art, and so on. But if you're talking about beauty and you're using these examples, it's because you think that you're acting under the hypothesis or assumption that beauty itself is a one. Now, most of our literature does not do that anymore. It acts as if beauty is an opinion held by a certain culture for a period of time, and there is no beauty in itself. I just say that because I think that the opinion that Plato is attempting to establish here is now almost entirely rejected in our intellectual atmosphere. Okay, so yeah, this is the relation between the one, the one idea, the one being, and the many things claimed to be. And he says, and moreover, we say that the former are seen, that is, there are a number of beautiful or noble acts, works of art, etc. That's literally seen, but not intellected, while the ideas are intellected, but not seen. So the beauty that you're discussing in an argument about what beauty is not one object of the senses, whereas the acts themselves or the works themselves can be. Right, and then he goes on through, now he's going to go on and say, well, with regard to sight, a third thing is needed to make things visible, apart from the power of sight that your eye possesses and the colors that a thing possesses that mark it out from something else. And that third thing is light. And light is emitted from the sun. And so it's the sun that makes possible the visibility of the being of things in the sensual world. And he says, use that as an image of what I will call, and the good, or the idea of the good, which is that which provides the power of being known and the power of knowing it to the person who knows it. Now, that's just a very brief glimpse at a few lines, and we'll look at these again. But I just thought that might be helpful. So, and the distinction between one and many, the one look. Now, if you do undergraduate Plato classes, they will say something, may say something like, what Plato means is that you have an experience of many noble or beautiful things or just things. And that means that there is a single being, justice, which exists somewhere else in another realm. And that's absolutely not what he's saying. He wrote a whole entire dialogue called the Parmenides to prove that there is no such thing as a separate being of which these are literally reflections, because that makes the being, the idea or the look of a thing, into a thing. And what we're trying to do is explain the being of things and not reduce being to a thing. I hope that didn't sound too much like gibberish, but I just vividly remember being told similar things when as an undergraduate. Now, should we do more of this or go back to Heidegger?
Could we stick with this for a little bit? Is that possible?
Sure, sure. Okay, so
Sorry, can I ask one question, Martin?
please.
I struggle with understanding the forms not as things. As in, I get why it's problematic to describe them as things, I think. But then when I try to think of them not as things, but the things which, I don't know if I'm right to think this, like shape the way that we perceive the world. So for instance, like if I'm looking at a tree or something, there's a form of my experience which allows me to, I don't know, separate like the tree from the background or something. Is that kind of what he means by a form? Yeah, I don't know. I just find it confusing. So is it possible to clarify that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of important aspects to what he means by the form. And one is that it allows you to pick out the identity of a thing. So the tree from, and then within species of trees. Now, if you're differentiating a tree from a shrub, you're not going to do it on the basis of sense perception, because there are so many shrubs that bear similarities in color, formation of leaf or whatever, that you're not going to be able to make a distinction. It's the whole proportion of different elements together, and that unity that is required for an identity is what picks something out, and that's something accessible not to the senses but to the mind. I can possibly make this a little bit clearer, and Socrates in the Phaedo says this might be a clearer example. We'll see. But he says, is a two the result of the addition of two ones or the division of a one? And what he means to suggest by this is that you can see a two come into being out of the division of a one, or you can see a two coming into being out of the placing together of two ones. But that doesn't explain what two is. But the fact that you can recognize any pair as a pair is not reducible to what those things are, whether they're abstract numbers, they're bushes, they're people, they're attributes. That to see the unity of a pair as a pair is not something reducible either to the process that came into being or the central attributes of the particular things. And this is why number is a really important example or ladder on the way to the understanding of being for Plato and Aristotle, because there appears to be a stability to the unities of number that we can count on, that we can rely on. And it doesn't matter what they are. If we're talking about 5 sheep or trees or hares, it has the same unity and stability as a number.
And when we say it, right, are we saying that like we're making like a psychological point about the fact that we can recognize 5 or whatever it is, and that's just an innate idea that we have? Or
not, I wouldn't say an innate idea, but we have a mind which is receptive to the character of things, the intellectual character of things. And the intellectual character of 2 is different from the sensual character when you see 2 people.
Okay. Yeah.
but you can't make sense of that central experience. If you see two people and you pick them out of a crowd on some basis, you know them, they're particularly tall or something. If you pick them out, you're not doing that on the basis of the senses, which is just a whole lot of different colors, right? You're picking out a unity that is intellectual and not sensual. This is the suggestion, which I happen to find persuasive, which means at all times, I will leave out gaps in the argument because I'm persuaded. So it's very good if you keep questioning that and argue against it, because I'm inclined to skip over the parts that make it persuasive because I've already been persuaded.
All right, can I ask one more thing there?
Please.
If it's not completely tiresome, and I'm sorry if I'm blowing it, but say I do see two people and they're equal height, and I say, well, okay, equality is the equal is a thing. Then I turn that, I mean, yeah, I've just done it, turned it into a thing, right? So I just don't get how to fix that step in my, is that how Plato is thinking about it in terms of saying, okay, well, the equal and not equal are a form, and that is something that we like enables us to recognize that quality of those two beings or whatever? Is that?
Yes, but we're not, what he's not wanting to say is that we turn these things into beings,
Yeah.
into things. We turn the being of a thing into a thing itself. Then you have this problem of, well, so the essence is a thing inside this other thing. We don't need the other thing. I mean, we don't need the essence. We just have the thing. Right? That's sort of like the modern empirical suggestion.
Okay.
Can I,
Please.
tell me, Martin, if this is another way to say it. So when we see a pair of people, or see something in the garden, those beings exist in the sense of, and this word exist is like stand out. They stand out. Whereas the forms do not stand out. They can't be seen with the eyes, but unless you have the forms, those things can't stand out. So the forms are the invisible precondition, shall we say, for the things which do stand out, the beings.
So our experience of anything, our normal experience of anything has these two aspects, sensual and intellectual, which appears to be restricted to the humans as opposed to the animals, who don't seem to have that intellectual openness in the same way, which also appears to be related to the fact that they don't have language. I realize there are 100,000 researchers torturing monkeys right now to prove that wrong, but they haven't yet succeeded. Yeah, but yeah, any other?
Yeah, I do have a question.
Please.
From what I've seen, from what I've heard, it seems like let's use a tree as an example, right? So Plato would say to perceive this as a tree, you would see in this tree some form of treeness that makes this a tree that you see as a tree. Then what about, for example, you don't just see this as a tree, right? See this, for example, as a palm tree or as a coconut tree or as some form of tree. So do these forms also exist? Like the palm treeness,
Yeah.
the coconut treeness, or some other forms of tree that is sort of like a subcategory of tree. Do they exist as well?
Well, we get a very sensible answer if we go to Aristotle, right? The fundamental form is the species form of the palm tree and so on. And that's fundamental. And we can draw the abstract genus out of that. And there are individual differences. This tree wasn't well watered, so it has brown leaves and so on. But that's the fundamental kind, is the species kind. It's not so clear what Plato is saying, because he sometimes seems to suggest that if you can pick it out and differentiate it, that's because it has an intellectual form, which would mean there are forms of artifacts, of minor varieties in plants and so on.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
sorry, please go on. Go on.
Please, no.
Oh no, because because if he allows that, as in if he allows palm treeness and coconut treeness to be a subcategory of tree of forms, then you can say the same thing about subcategories of palm trees. You can branch out different palm trees. I'm not expert of botany, but let's say there are different types of palm trees, and under different type of palm trees, you can still subdivide it by the same principle until you get to the point where you have each individual palm tree as a form of unique palm treeness. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then you can still keep branching it, and then now you go into things that does not exist but still have a form. As in, you've got some other, yeah. I see this as a problem, but I don't think Plato addresses it really head on. What do you think?
I think you're right. He's not addressing it head on in a way that we would find satisfying. But I think we could say from his point of view that the fact that we could go through that exercise that you elaborated, we would still in every case need to identify that this is a palm tree, but that these two palm trees are different. And they're different in a way. I would suggest we can't get down to the individual, because at some point before we get to the individual, we have a species kind that's a multitude, a many over one. And we're saying this subcategory, we can identify it as being different now, but it must be in some way, I don't want to use this term and cause too many problems, essentially different from the one that has a slightly different character. Yep, so we're talking about Indian and African elephants, for example. Both manifestly belong to the same species, but both apparently, I don't know how, you can differentiate by some characteristic that all of the Indian elephants share and the African ones share. And so that, now, he's not saying that there is some top-down categorization of things in which you begin with this being and then you divide it. He's saying in order to pick out this elephant, whether you're referring to elephants as a whole or just Indian elephants, that there must be something in them, in the look they present to the mind eye, that is different from the other animals and the other kind of elephants.
I feel like mine is just a little, it's a digression of what he's trying to say, I guess. Yeah, that makes sense.
So Martin, what do you think about what Chris just said? Because I thanks, Chris, if that's right. I thought that helped. So is it that helped me anyway? Is it that the forms of the preconditions which would allow us to make the judgments which would distinguish between those two elephants, and that's what the forms are. They're the things that would enable us to differentiate between them.
Yes.
Yeah.
The form. So, yeah, the form has a couple of different chief aspects. One is it allows you to identify something, yeah, and identify it in differentiation from its central aspect. And people want to say, no, let's just be sensible. Things are what we sensibly perceive them to be. Heidegger has a very good example of why that's not the case when he talks about a piece of chalk. Like the actual meaning of a piece of chalk is not reducible to white, cylindrical, slightly dusty. That doesn't actually tell you what that piece of chalk is. It's an artifact with a whole array of different possibilities that belongs to a particular context in which someone is trying to communicate something and so on. And that's true. That's the true meaning of it. But the problem is, how do we account for that? And he wants to account for it by an historical world in which this particular artifact has a place, and that makes some sense. But Plato would want to relate it back to the difference between nature and artifacts. And these artifacts are instruments that human beings make to complete some aspect of their nature. And they're visible as aspects of that intention to complete your nature. So, for example, a piece of chalk may be an instrument developed in the interest of becoming wiser. But yes, the fact that we do pick, he's not trying to say, I have this theory about how things are. He's saying, look at what you already experience. You have this capacity to differentiate. This is what that experience must be. And this is what, say, Kant is doing too. He's saying, look, things are intelligible and not just measurable by the senses. What accounts for that? And he accounts for it in a radically different way from Plato, but they're both looking at the sensible and the intelligible aspect of the things we experience, because both are present to us.
Okay.
Yeah, that came across far more esoteric than I intended, because this, as Anson, Haddon, and Chris have brought out, it's a very multifarious and difficult area. So, but please do continue to ask questions, and especially to challenge what Plato and what Heidegger seem to suggest, because it's only when we challenge it that we really learn anything from either. Now he goes through. I do want to. It's 6:30 now, so I do want to. I'll do a little bit more of this, because it just helps us to read Heidegger. But we will go back in more detail and look at it again. But yeah, I think it'll help to run through some aspects. So he does say. So he says that sight requires not just the eyes, but and the thing seen, but a third class of thing, and that is light. And here down at 507E, he says, then the sense of sight in the human being and the power of being seen in the thing are yoked together with a yoke that, by the measure of a look, an idea, by no means insignificant, is more honorable than the yokes uniting other teams, if light is not without honor. Okay, so the sensible meaning of this is, you see something, and that relies on not just the thing seen and your eye, but light. And if light is the yoke between those two, and it belongs to something honorable because it belongs to the sun, which in ordinary understanding is a god. Right? Okay, so down to here. Is sight then naturally related to this god, the sun, in the following way? How? Neither sight itself nor that in which it comes to be, what we call the eye, is the sun. Surely not, says Glaucon. Assuming this is Glaucon, yes. But I suppose it is the most sunlike, and that's the word that Margarita pointed out before, helioides. It has the same form as the sun in some way, of the organs of the senses. Yes, by far. Doesn't it get the power it has as a sort of overflow from the sun's treasury? Most certainly. And this is a play on the words before, because he was saying, what is the highest object of the understanding? And he says, Socrates says, I can't give it to you directly, but I can give you the interest, and I'll pay off the main principle later on. And so this reference to the treasury is, implicitly relates to this. So, and the sun isn't sight either, is it? But as the cause of sight is seen by sight itself. That's so, he said. Well then, say that the sun is the offspring of the good. I mean an offspring the good begot in a proportion with itself, as the good is in the intelligible region with respect to intelligence and what is intellected. So the sun is in the visible region with respect to sight and what is seen. Okay, so that's not easy. So we see things with our eyes. They have a sensible character, and that act of seeing is only possible because the sun illuminates both, and ultimately the sun is responsible for there being eyes and things, and that is human beings who are alive, because there's warmth and light and so on. So he's saying that indirect significance that the sun possesses in our sense perception, that's what he's going to call the idea of the good possesses in the intelligible aspect of things. That is, the good, or the idea of the good, is somehow responsible for the illumination of the things that are intelligible, and our ability to intellect them, to see them with the intellect. Okay. we'll go on just a little bit further, and then I want to jump to another metaphor he makes. So, but I suppose when one turns the eyes on those things illuminated by the sun, they see clearly, and sight shows itself to be in these same eyes. Yes. Well then, think that the soul itself is also characterized in this way. So we have the eye perceiving sensually and the soul intellecting. When it fixes itself on that which is illuminated by truth and that which is in being, it intellects, knows, and appears to possess intelligence. But when it fixes itself on that which is mixed with darkness, that is coming into being and passing away, it opines and is dimmed, changing opinions up and down, and seems at such times not to possess intelligence. That's difficult, but I'll give an example and you can question it. If we had a firm intellectual grasp of what justice actually is, then in our understanding and in our actions as regard to a just action or making a just law and so on, it will appear that we have some intelligence. But if we've taken some opinion about what justice is, some singular opinion that abstracts from many other aspects of justice and act on that, we will sometimes appear just and sometimes unjust, because we haven't understood justice as a whole. The same if we collected trees on the basis of a very partial understanding of what a tree is and excluded half the species and so on. So there's an understanding that the understanding, if it could grasp the whole, would lead to intelligence in thought and act, as opposed to not grasping the whole of what a thing is. Now, so that I'll just read one more sentence from here. That therefore say that what provides the truth to the things known, and truth, as Heidegger has pointed out, is this word aletheia, and it's not bad to think of the way he interprets that. Something that is now revealed or unhidden. The truth is that which reveals a thing to be what it is. And this is important for Heidegger and for Plato. For Plato, that's basic. The idea shows you what a thing is, and that's our basic understanding of things. What is the Socratic question in the Platonic dialogues? T esti dikaiosuner, or to kalon, or whatever it is. What is such and such? That's the fundamental question, and that brings you to the intellect. That means that your conversation circles around what you intellect of the form of the being of the thing. So that's the fundamental question, not how did it come into being, not what are the elements that make it up, unless you have your eye on the thing itself. Okay, so therefore, that's what Heidegger wants to question, and that he thinks that's inadequate because you've made the whatness, which you associate with the look, which has appeared to you at one time in history, and you want to make that the permanent understanding of truth or justice or nobility, whereas in fact these things are given differently in different epochs. That's why he's arguing this is a transformation in the essence of truth, and one which is an error. Okay, so therefore say that what provides the truth to the things known and gives power to the one who knows is the idea of the good, on the model of the sun and the eye and the things seen, and is the cause of knowledge and truth. You can understand it to be a thing known. So in one sense, it's known because it's indirectly responsible for knowledge and truth. But as fair as these two are, knowledge and truth, if you believe that it is something different from them and still fairer than they, still more beautiful, your belief will be right. So it's not characterizable. You can't characterize what he calls the good or the idea of the good as a thing itself and as a noble thing, like knowledge and truth.
Martin, could I ask a question there? So Heidegger sees this big change happening with Plato, and Plato's preceded by the Greek poets who you mentioned in week one, and the pre-Socratic philosophers. So is Heidegger saying that they are an example of a different conception of truth, or perhaps the example of a different conception of truth?
Yes, the pre-Socratic thinkers, especially Heraclitus and Parmenides, yes, they do not share Plato's version of the truth. Yeah.
And if I'm not wrong, though the pre-Socratic thinkers are most striking for the enigmatic quality of what they wrote. So, and I guess what I'm saying there is that the meaning is definitely obscure, and it can only be clarified, after the event later on by, let's say, prosaic discussions of the meaning of these enigmatic phrases.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, Nietzsche and Heidegger both admire the pre-Socratics, and partly it's because they wrote in poetry. They wrote, Empedocles writes in dactylic hexameter. Parmenides writes a poem in which he discusses, the character of being in truth. And they aspire to that. I mean, Heidegger wrote poetry himself, and Nietzsche writes in aphorisms, which he says these are meant to be read together so that sparks fly off between them, and then you have some insight, because what I'm saying can't be put strictly into words. And this is, I think, a correct aspect of the self-understanding of both Nietzsche and Heidegger, that if the truth is not atemporal, it's not eternally unchanging, then you're not going to be able to get at the truth in ordinary speech. You're going to have to be assisted to see that truth is not a thing. It's an emergence. It's a process of emergence of the truth that is given differently in different times. And that means you can't use ordinary discourse. Well, you can, but you're referring to something outside of what discourse can straightforwardly demonstrate to you, which is partly, that Heidegger makes this reference to leaving behind being and time, because the structure, the phenomenological, transcendental, existential analysis, that structure is not going to be able to get at the truth which is given poetically.
Martin, just one small question, although you may address it later when we're reading Heidegger. So Heidegger would suggest to replace the term idea of the good into the idea of ideas. I think, unless I've misread, but I just wonder if there's any assumption in this substitution.
Yeah, I think that's rhetorical, and it's not in Plato's text. But it fits in with Heidegger's critique. So I would say that's
because I feel like if it's substituted, it will make the whole text read a lot easier. Because now you introduce some term for the good that has, well, you need a lot more explanation as to what good is, as opposed to idea, which is sort of similar to the form that he has explained already.
Yeah, my difficulty though is saying idea of idea, is that turns these things into things of things. Yeah, if we need the idea to explain a thing, because it's the main thing that explains these other things, then we need another idea to explain those ideas, and then we need another idea to explain that. I'm possibly going on a different path, but this is my inclination when I see the phrase idea of ideas, because he deliberately says here that the good is in some sense responsible for knowledge and truth, but it's not something knowable like them. And now in this metaphor of the cave that we've been looking at, the freed prisoner goes outside and looks at the images in the water, and then eventually is able to look at the things, the animals and the humans, the plants, And then at last is able to look up to the sun and realize it's the cause of the illumination and of the being of these things. Now, that would mean that wisdom is possible. And I think that's part of the context of this dialogue. We're not going to have wise rulers if wisdom is impossible. So he's leaving that open, that possibility. He uses the same metaphor of the sun in the Phaedo and says, this is precisely what we can't do. We can't look at the being of beings. We must see it reflected in speech, in logoi, in speeches. So we have to make our way through speech, which is indirectly illuminated by our vague apprehension or divination of the whole of things. And that's why he's arguing for dialectic as opposed to a more strict scientific methodology or something like that. That's gone way off topic from your comment, but
Martin, I have a question.
please.
Concerning the previous paragraph, my mind's been working on that. Did you say in that paragraph that to know a thing, we must know everything about the thing?
I didn't mean to say that. But what I meant to say was that we're not able to pick something out unless we recognize it as what it is. And this means what Plato is suggesting is that we pick things out fundamentally as what they are. Human beings, artifacts, plants. And that ability means that they must present something to the mind that is different from the other things. And that's the look of the thing, to the mind's eye, the idea, the form. Now, because we do see everything from a perspective. So as soon as we try and put into speech what we've seen, we produce a perspective on that thing. We start talking about justice and providing examples and arguments about certain principles, but they're all partial. We can't bring into speech, possibly in principle, we can't bring into speech the whole of what we might see.
I'll have to listen to that again on the recording.
But Martin, I think you've said that your position, tell me if I'm wrong, I think you've said that your position in opposition to Nietzsche is that even if that's the case, it's meaningful to think about something that we call justice. And that's also Plato's position, right?
Yeah, let's not bring in Nietzsche. We've got enough material to work on. And I do want to get back to the essay. What I thought I might do quickly is so that's the first metaphor for what he calls the good, or the idea of the good. He says that it has a relation to the things we see with the mind's eye, as the sun does with the things we see with our sensual eye. And the second metaphor is he draws a divided line. And I think if we just touch on this, I was intending to go through this in much greater detail next Tuesday, but it would probably help if we just have a brief introduction. So he says here, Glaucon, can think, conceive that, as we say, these two things are the intelligible, the things that we intellect, and the things that we sense. And that the one, the idea of the good, is the king of the intelligible class and region, while the other is the king, the sun is the king of the visible. And then he makes a joke that is not even hilarious if you know Greek, so we'll skip that. So now, do you have these two forms, visible and intelligible, which is funny because the intelligible is the region of the forms, right? So the visible, to talk about the visible, we make it into a form. So everything we think and talk about has an intellectual aspect. And you can't talk about everything that's sensual on sensual terms. You're talking about that as having a different look to the mind's eye of the intelligible. Now, so that's the first sort of famous image, the sun as the image of the idea of the good. And then the second famous image is a divided line. And the third is the cave, which we've been discussing. And so the second, it begins here, and he says, then, take a line cut in two unequal segments, one for the class that is seen, the other for the class that is intellected. So our experience, our reception to the world, pictured as a line which is divided in, not in halves because they're two unequal segments. Intellected, let's just say intellect at the top and sensed below. And go on and cut each segment in the same ratio. Okay, so we have, I'm just going to pretend it goes this way. Intellected, sensible. Within the intellected, there's a large proportion of one and less of the other. Within a sensible, there's a certain proportion and then a smaller proportion. The same ratio on each one. I'll draw a picture and we can discuss it in more detail next Tuesday. Now, in terms of relative clarity and obscurity, so this is one aspect of our experience of the world, not how we passionately respond to it and so on, but just our openness to it and it's the clarity with which we receive what it has to show us. So you'll have one section in the visible part for images. I mean by images, first shadows, then appearances produced in water and in all close-grained, smooth, bright things and everything of the sort. I understand. Then in the other segment, put that of which the first is the likeness, the animals around us and everything that grows and the whole class of artifacts. Okay, so we have the bottom part of the line. In the bottom of that, there are images, so which you can see in water or mirrors, images of animals and artifacts and humans. In the top part, there are the actual things those are images of. Now, the reason why you're going up in clarity or obscurity is an image of a thing depends for what it shows us on the thing that it shows. So the image in the water tends to have less clarity than the animal that you can see reflected in the water. Same with the mirror image. Same with the image we have of each other through the Zoom. Right? We have a less full perception of each other than we would if we're in the same room and we can see more of each other and more gestures and so on. Okay, so an image, and Deborah was making this point last week. An image is something. It is something, but on the other hand, it is also dependent for what it is on something else. So, and that's the actual things that we experience centrally. Right, so then, yes. And he said, would you also be willing to say that with respect to truth or lack of it, as the opinable, what is an object of an opinion is distinguished from what is an object of knowledge, so the likeness is distinguished from that of which it is the likeness. So an image, to recognize an image of something is to have an opinion about it, but to see the thing itself is to have knowledge that there is indeed before me a book or a dog. Okay, so now they come to the upper portion of the line, the intelligible section of the line. Now, similarly, just as we can use an image of something we see in a mirror or in water to understand something of the things, in our thinking aspect as human beings, we use as images. Okay, I'll read the whole sentence and then come back and try and make sense of it. In one part of it, a soul, using as images the things that were previously imitated, is compelled to investigate on the basis of hypotheses and make its way to a beginning, not to a beginning, but to an end. Okay, so I'll stop there. So using as images the things that were previously imitated. And what that means is, so in the lower part of the line, there are images of pigs in water and there are pigs. Now, in the upper part of the line, if we start talking about pigs, what a pig is, how pigs act, we're treating all the numerous individual pigs as if they're one being. We're using the things as if they're images of the form of what a pig is. Because we're not talking about individual pigs, we're talking about the habits of pigs, the diet of pigs and so on. So yeah, so using as images the things that were previously imitated. And we investigate on the basis of the hypothesis that there is such a thing as the essence of being a pig. While in the other part, the top part, it makes its way to a beginning that is free from hypotheses, starting out from hypotheses and without the images used in the other part. By means of forms themselves, it makes its inquiry through them. Now, that's difficult, and I don't even want to discuss it, but it's, so what he's saying is, on the one hand, when we talk on in the top part of the line, when we talk about something, justice, pigs, we are hypothesizing that the things we experience are related to a unity, justice, the essence of being a pig. And we do that on the basis of our intellection of the idea of the pig, the idea of justice. And that apprehension, the intellection of the idea, is the top part of the line. So our capacities are the very top, noesis, the intellection of the beings, and then thought, dianoia, discursive thought, in which we make conceptions, develop them, and argue and form logical arguments and so on, and mathematical formula. And then below that, sense perception of individual existing things, and then below that, the images of individual existing things. And so this is the divided line, and at each cut, there's the sun ruling the lower half and the idea of the good ruling the upper half. Now, some of you I know this through repeated reading and understand it very well. And for some of you, it's probably the first time you've heard this discussion. I've gone through it at an extraordinarily rapid pace. So we will go through it again and in more detail. And
Martin, is there any significance in the fact that some forms are much more easily intellected, such as the form of shape, such as a 10 centimetre circle or a 5 centimetre square, and that some things are much more difficult to intellect, such as justice or love? And is anything made of that big difference?
sorry, I'm just trying to share something that Kirsten just sent me, which may help. Are you seeing a divided line? No. Yes?
Yeah.
I sent it to everyone.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, now the author of this line has interpreted the proportions the opposite way that I have. I gave the ideas the biggest part. Doesn't matter. Images, things that we see, and then images, that is the particular beings we discuss and their unity apprehended by the intellect. I will develop a picture for next time, for time after next. Now,
So in that image, I guess when it says intelligible, it means only intelligible, whereas the visible things are both visible to the eyeballs and also intelligible, right?
well, yeah, it's trying to divide them for the purpose of argument, but in our actual experience, of course, they're not divisible. Now, I feel like I've neglected Heidegger far too much, but I hope that provides some sense of what he's arguing with. And there's been a couple of mentions of the essay, The Essence of Truth. And in this essay, he's saying there's a change in the essence of truth. Now, this is just in this one word, the way he's using the word essence, you get the whole difference between him and classical philosophy. In classical philosophy, the notion of an essence refers to that being which allows you to see particular beings that are coming into being and coming and going out of being. The form of kangaroo allows you to see that this is a kangaroo, that's a young kangaroo, that's an old kangaroo, and that is no longer a kangaroo because it's been hit by a car, but it was, when it was alive, a kangaroo. You can make these identifications because of this aspect to the intelligible form. And that means they must share some kind of essence, however we understand that, which would be the unchanging character of things. Heidegger uses the word essence as if it's a verb, as if things come into a certain essence. The meaning of things changes, the essence of things changes. So you can write an essay called The Essence of Truth, because what truth is changes. And that's one of the suggestions he's making in this essay about Plato. And that's very counterintuitive from the classical point of view. Now, we write on 7. We just might read a paragraph or two of Heidegger and then have the break. So last time, we discussed education and mentioned briefly how he translates it to the Greek and the German for education. And I want to now go to page 167. I'll just Is that invisible for size, or is that?
Good for me.
Okay. Okay, so I want to have a look at this paragraph here on the right-hand side. Plato's assertion is clear, which I can't do at the moment with this. Okay. But yeah, where that cursor is. Okay, so Plato's assertion is clear. The allegory of the cave illustrates the essence of education. And his interpretation of this is to say that Plato is saying the truth is accessible to you to varying degrees in these various places, fundamentally within the cave and outside the cave. And the education is the education into the truth. By contrast, the interpretation of the allegory that we are now going to attempt means to point out the Platonic doctrine of truth, that is the actual teaching of which Plato is not fully aware. Are we not then burdening the allegory with something foreign to it? The interpretation threatens to degenerate into a reinterpretation that does violence to the text. And he says, let this appearance stand until we have confirmed our insight. Now, so does that make some sense? Obviously, if you're going to interpret an author against the author's intentions, you need an author with considerable powers of self-awareness. You need a very strong reason. And he's just saying, I signal my awareness of this problem, but I think the interpretation is justified when I've made it. Okay, so this is, and our insight, as opposed to Plato's insight, that Plato's thinking subjects itself to a transformation in the essence of truth that becomes the hidden law governing what the thinker says. So it's hidden from Plato himself that this law of the transformation of truth is governing his own composition. According to our interpretation, which is made necessary from out of a future need. Now, if there's no unchanging eternal truth, as Heidegger is suggesting, then your interest in past philosophers is no longer what it was up until 1800, right? Which is that past philosophers are seeking answers to the same questions you are, but there are no same questions if things have been given historically. But our future need can make us want to understand what happens with Plato if Plato is part of an historical process that we are now experiencing the results of. And this is what his suggestion is, that what begins with Plato ends with Nietzsche, and we are now in a crisis of our want of contact with the truth because of that process. Okay, so that's our future need. The allegory not only illustrates the essence of education, but at the same time opens our eyes to a transformation in the essence of truth. If the allegory can show both the essence of education and a transformation in the essence of truth, must it not be the case that an essential relation holds between education and truth? This relation does in fact obtain, and it consists in the fact that the essence of truth and the sort of transformation it undergoes here first makes possible education in its basic structure. That is, only by this assertion, which Heidegger is questioning, that there is an ahistorical, unchanging, atemporal truth, do you get the whole notion of education that derives from the classics and became our education up until the 19th century, and which he wants to overcome. And so then the next topic is the link between education on the one hand and truth on the other, and why he is suggesting that they are an essential unity, an original and essential unity. Now, he begins with education, or paideia, as being the turning around of the whole soul, which we had before. So I just have to manipulate a few. So education, as given in the allegory, is the turning around of the soul and the transfer of the human being from the cave to the outside, where things are accessible to the mind. And I'll just read this end of this paragraph here, and then we can break. Well, I can't pick out things. No. Okay. This transfer is possible only by the fact that everything which has been heretofore manifest to human beings, as well as the way in which it has been manifest, gets transformed. Whatever has been unhidden, which is his interpretive translation of the word aletheia for truth, whatever has been unhidden to human beings at any given time, as well as the manner of its unhiddenness, has to be transformed. In Greek, unhiddenness is called aletheia, a word which we translate as truth. And for a long time now in Western thinking, truth has meant the agreement of the representation in thought with the thing itself. And ad aequatio intellectus et rave, which comes from Aquinas. So the truth is the equivalence of what you think and what the thing is, and sometimes called the correspondence theory of truth. And that understanding of truth, he is asserting, derives from what we've seen in the allegory of the cave, and leads to the later history of it that we'll read in Aristotle and Aquinas and Nietzsche.
But isn't that correct? I mean, we do have this, that if you describe a thing, we think we have said the truth about it without necessarily knowing what the thing is. I mean, like you mentioned the piece of chalk. You know, it's true.
Yeah, okay, but say, adopting Heidegger's point for the moment, so, you know, when he describes that piece of chalk in the Introduction to Metaphysics, you know, he refers to the world within which that chalk has meaning, in which there is learning, there are schools and so on. Without all those human intentions, and that without that whole human orientation, it doesn't have that meaning. And he, I think, takes that to be part of the aspect of all things, that they become visible and meaningful within a certain comportment, his term, at least in the translation, or orientation of human beings. But that doesn't mean that, but he wants to resist the notion that it's purely subjective, that we can turn the piece of chalk into something else just by thinking it so, or, you know, give it a entirely different significance just out of willing it to be so. That he wants to avoid that too, which is why he is saying that we've misunderstood the idea of truth as the coextensively unhiddenness and hiddenness operating together. So it's not us being able to, willfully saying certain things are true, and it's not just our subjective reflection on things that are true. Things are given to us differently in different times, and that's why he's saying that it's the, Plato, by saying, the truth is just saying something that corresponds to how things are. He's forgetting that the apprehension of how things are itself is not something stable, because what things are, their essence is not something stable.
So Martin, does Heidegger accept the proposition in Aristotle's Metaphysics that
I think we can stop right there. No, but carry on.
if a human being is thinking something which is the same as the thing being thought about, then I think Aristotle says then there is a case of true thinking. In other words,
you're referring to Book Gamma of the Metaphysics, where but Aristotle's fundamental definition of what we now call the principle of non-contradiction is not that things that contradict themselves can't be true. It's that the same being can't be what it is and be the opposite of that at the same time, in the same respect, in the same place, and so on. So the truth fundamentally is in the being, and then derivatively, our contradicting ourselves in speech makes that argument implausible, because things themselves are one way and not another way. Does that make so? Yeah. Heidegger would agree with, well, he says of Plato and Aristotle that they have both of these things in their teaching, that truth belongs to what is visible in a thing, and truth belongs to our speech, but they're in tension, and what becomes dominant is what we think of things. But yeah, we should have our break and come back at 20 past. And so I hope you'll have more questions, but we will work our way through some more pages then. Thanks.
Well, that would suggest then that there are things that exist that not only do we not perceive, but our brains literally cannot perceive. And then that means that things exist and there is a truth independent of any notion or perception or idea that we might have about them. And so it starts with this inability of the brain to perceive everything, and then whether or not, infrared, ultraviolet, and then whether that's developed at all in the thinking that we've been discussing. And I suppose the end to all of that, is how rooted in 19th, early 20th century science was Heidegger.
Fairly well rooted.
Right.
I think he was still supervising mathematics PhDs.
Yeah.
But I think that the basic point is, though, if you accept the distinction between sense perception and the intellectual look of a thing, then the character of your sense perception is not of the highest importance. You may have a much broader part of the color spectrum accessible to you, to your senses, right? Yeah. You're still seeing or not seeing a dog, whichever part of that spectrum is available to you. So, and people who are much more materialistic minded would say, no, the thing that's accessible to you is that which comes through the senses, and you only have this part of the spectrum. But from this point of view, from the classical point of view, it's not irrelevant, but a blind person could have the idea of the dog because they've smelt and felt a dog that someone else recognizes by seeing it.
Yeah, it was one step. It was one step more than that. Sorry, and thank you for that. What I'm trying to understand is whether or not the fact of that limitation on sense perception then establishes the notion, independent of whether we actually can perceive or smell or hear a dog, but that the fact that that limitation on sense perception then is the basis to, I don't want to say the word prove, but to then say that there are things that exist which we are incapable of perceiving. Or is that can you use that base? Can you use that initial fact if you want to then establish that? Has that been explored or developed, or is that just not even?
Well, I'm sure there's lots of contemporary versions
Right.
saying that, but I can't understand that step because
Okay.
the sense perception is not vital.
Okay. All right.
There are many different sense perceptions associated with anything that you could understand, but it's the understanding that's central.
Yeah, your reason.
Okay.
I think hopping on Stephen's idea, I think you can think about mathematics, right? We can't smell mathematics, we can't see mathematics, but anyhow, we still have mathematician, or even you and I can do simple maths, right? So the sensibility is not a limitation as to whether we can intelligent it or not. Yeah, if that's a word.
Yeah, no, I don't want to labour it, but maybe I'm not expressing it clearly. It's not so much that our sense perception is limited, it is, and then how that then translates into whether or not we can cogitate other things, but whether or not the fact that our sense perception is limited then means that there are things that exist and which are true, and that there is truth that we cannot comprehend, that we're just simply incapable of even thinking about or knowing, because our brains are not, we're just not wired that way. Just the physical matter inside our skulls just is incapable of understanding it. If we already know that at a base level we can't see infrared and ultraviolet, doesn't that then suggest that there are other things that we also can't know? It's a question. I mean, like I say, I don't want to take up too much time. I just had that floating in, but I'll take on board what everyone said and think about it some more.
It's a little bit like the sound in the forest problem.
Oh yeah, maybe. Yeah. Thank you.
Given what we've discovered with, microscopes and then electron microscopes, but these are aspects of things that we know that weren't known at all. I don't know if that changes our understanding of what the being of things is, though.
Not at all.
I mean, Stevens does have a point, I think, especially with Martin's idea of like the electron microscope and that stuff. Like, we don't know about electron like 200 years ago, and that is still, yeah. So to therefore to say, like in Stevens' idea, we don't have the apparatus, we don't have the machine itself to let us know that there is an electron there, and therefore the idea is not entertained or is not comprehended. If you want to put it that way, and we can interpret it in now, like we don't have the technology like 200 years later that can interpret ideas that's from 200 years later because of that technological gap or that sort of sensibility gap, so to say. And like, yeah, it is certainly an interesting idea.
It is. This might sound crazy, Stephen, but I'm inclined to think that we have learned everything we've learned relates to the meaning of things that we experience in our ordinary understanding.
Yeah.
So, an understanding of subatomic physics does not enrich our understanding of what it means to be human.
Exactly.
It's an aspect of something. And this is, Heidegger's particular concern is that our whole way of understanding has this character that modern science does. And modern science, in all of its beginning, is an instrument.
Yep. An
instrument of human power for certain goods that we take to be true, but we can't scientifically prove they're true under the new understanding of what science is, but which tends to turn everything into which, well, it itself is an instrument of goods posited. But that means it doesn't give us knowledge. In the classical sense, modern sciences aren't science. What they are instruments of, to quote Bacon, of modifying the underlying material of a thing. Now, we've learned a lot that we never knew, although they're still discovering species of amphibious fish in Greek islands that Aristotle knew that no one knew in the meantime. So they knew a lot, but the question is whether or not what we're learning is further power to manipulate the things that we already know. These are human beings, those are houses, those are trees. That's their fundamental aspect. And we're learning a lot more power over how to manipulate them, or we're discovering new things. That's the question anyway.
Yes.
But even if we do bridge the technology gap and do end up knowing a lot more things or sensing that there are a lot more things, the principles of how we do it and, well, the principle of intelligibility will still be the same, right? Yeah. It'll be either Heideggerian or Platonic. Probably Platonic.
Well, that's where I'm putting my $5. So,
I mean, one of the things that's been a scary thing for at least 20 years now is the potential, the obvious potential for genetic manipulation, so that human beings become things that they've never been before. You know, changing. You know.
Yeah, and this is clearly, I mean, I think that's a good example of where our sciences are means and instruments. But the problem, and this is a very simplistic way of putting it, but I think it deeply true, is that our sciences increase our power over human nature and nature as a whole, but they do not, first of all, they do not increase our wisdom about how to use that power. And secondly, they necessarily dissolve the horizon of understanding with which we might get some wisdom about how to use that power. And I think Heidegger would, obviously he has a far more sophisticated view than mine, but I think he would endorse that remark. And I think Plato would too, from their very different directions. Yeah. And this is our fundamental problem that we currently face, is that the bearings that we might have about how to use our powers are dissipating. At the very moment, our powers are radically increased. Okay, so, but we need to get more into the text so that we have better guidance than my random excogitations. So is it helpful to share the screen of the text we're looking at, or is it?
Yes, it is.
Okay, here we go. And I want to get to about, if we could get to page 179, that would be fantastic. That's only 5 pages we can do. Okay, so on the left-hand side, if it's not big enough, please yell at me.
Could you put it on a single page view rather than double page?
Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, yeah, it's just my ability to manipulate is not up to the.
Click on view and then.
It's a PDF though,
yeah,
so
it's not a sophisticated contemporary document where I can.
Yeah, but anyway.
Yeah, but yeah, this should do.
Right.
I just have to. Okay. Okay, so.
We can, however, manipulate from our side and make the screen bigger by moving the thing.
That's right.
Okay, so this top paragraph where it says, but if we are not satisfied with simply translating the words paideia, education, and aletheia, normally truth, literally, if instead we attempt to think through the issue according to the Greek way of knowing, and he refers shortly to the Greek sense of things and to Greek knowledge. Now, this is my departure, because from Plato's point of view, the Greek way of knowing is one cave of many from which you can ascend to towards the truth. You know, the Greek cave may be far more amply decorated. It may be already higher up and closer to the sun and so on and so forth. But and the models within it, the paradigms casting their shadows on the wall, may be of a much more deeper human richness than certain other caves. But it's one cave among many. So there's no Greek way of knowing. There's the Greek way of opining, of conviction, and so on. And then there's knowledge. And Heidegger obviously is saying no, that a people has its way of knowing because knowledge is given historically, because there's no atemporal knowledge. Okay, but if we think the issue according to the Greek way of knowing, and to ponder the essential matter that is at stake in these translations, then straight away education and truth come together into an essential unity. If we take seriously the essential content of what the word aletheia names, then we must ask, from what perspective does Plato approach his determination of the essence of unhiddenness? For the answer, yeah, okay, and I think I have somehow skipped back. No, that's where we were. Sorry, my text is. Yeah, I'll have to get a superior manipulable thing. Okay, apologies. So where are we? This is why classrooms with books are much better. Okay, we must ask from what perspective. Okay, for the answer to this question, we referred to the proper content. So there's the content that Plato posits in his depiction of the cave analogy, and then there's the proper content, which is the unthought and which Plato was not aware of. So we referred to the proper content of the allegory of the cave. The answer will show both the fact that and the way in which the allegory deals with the essence of truth. Now, his way of demonstrating this is to talk through the movements of the person who is freed, made to turn around, walks up through the cave, and then outside, and then has their eyes adjust to the light of the sun and the things as they are, and then has to come back down into the cave. And he divides that into 4 stages. And he says in the next paragraph, the unhidden and its unhiddenness designated each point what is present and manifest in the region where human beings happen to dwell. So in other words, the 4 stages: in the cave and chained up, looking at the wall, being released, turned around and being dragged up out of the cave, being outside the cave. These are 3 levels in which the truth is accessible. That's the fundamental claim. Now for him, the coming back into the cave obviously represents a conflict of a certain kind, and we'll come to that shortly, but it doesn't change the understanding of truth. And here is where I'll present a different interpretation. Okay, we'll skip through stages 1 and 2. The first, he describes people are chained in the cave, engrossed in what they immediately encounter. And so he has turned what Plato presents to us as a depiction of being part of any discursive political community whatsoever. He has turned that into being engrossed in the everyday. So for him, the authentic life is not the life that differs because it finds some other truth, but it's an authentic appropriation of what is given to your people at a particular time. Now, so that's why he's changed the language somewhat. Okay. But that's just hinted at in the language he uses. So stage 2 is being released from the chains. And then he says that in this final line on page 168, the things themselves, and here he means the artifacts. So not the images you see on the cave wall, but the artifacts are revealed. Let's try and get this PDF. Obey my. Yeah, the things themselves, that is the artifacts made by, let's say, well, the people who walk behind the wall, the poets, offer their visible form in a certain way, namely in the glow of the man-made fire of the cave. Now, I want to skip down to what he says about the truth on this level. He says, therefore the word aletheres, truth, occurs again at the end of the description of stage 2, and now in the comparative degree, alethestera, the more unhidden. The more proper truth is to be found in the shadows. So even those who have been freed from their chains still assess wrongly in what they posit as true, because they lack the prior condition for assessing, namely freedom. Now, in Plato's view, the people who are turned around and dragged up want to say they can look back, as Heidegger brings out beautifully in his description there, and they see the clarity of the shadows on the wall much more clearly than they can see the artificial fire in the cave and the things that illuminate it, because their eyes are not adjusted. And Heidegger interprets that as somehow a lack of freedom in orientation. Okay, and then he gets to stage 3. Real freedom is only attained in stage 3. Here, someone who has been unshackled is at the same time conveyed outside the cave into the open, in brackets. He uses this metaphor of there being an open space in which things are intelligible, and he means, this temporal, historical aspect of openness, rather than it being the one openness for human beings, as Plato seems to intend it. Okay, so there above ground, all things are manifest. The looks that show what things are now no longer appear merely in the man-made and confusing glow of the fire within the cave. The things themselves stand there in the binding force and validity of their own visible form. I will read to the end of this page. The open into which the free prisoner has now been placed does not mean the unboundedness of some wide open space. Rather, the open sets boundaries to things and is the binding power characteristic of the brightness radiating from the sunlight, which we also see. So the openness and the ability to see things as they are is not freedom in the sense of arbitrariness. It's the ability to be open to what is actually the case, which means to be determined by the way things are, their binding power. And what those things are is now the forms. I just have to. Yeah, I'm going to have to get a one-page PDF of this that I can manipulate. Okay, the idea, the ideas, or the forms, which constitute the essence in whose light each individual being shows itself as this or that. And only in this self-showing does the appearing thing become unhidden and accessible, which I think is a reasonable suggestion of how Plato understands the idea. Only if it's a unity that has a certain identity is it visible as this and not that. It's a human being, it's not a plant, and so on. And that aspect, which I think he brings out quite well, he also brings out down below at this line. where he's talking about the ideas, and he says the most unhidden, the most true in our ordinary translation, shows itself in each case in the whatness of a being. And I just refer again to the fact that it's widely acknowledged that the Socratic question within the Platonic dialogues, within Xenophon's dialogues of Socrates, is what is something or other? Because that's the being of the thing, and to go back behind the being to look at the genesis of the thing is less informative about it. Okay. So further into the next paragraph, liberation. Liberation does not come about by the simple removal of the chains, and it does not consist in unbridled license. Rather, it first begins as the continuous effort at accustoming one's gaze to be fixed on the firm limit of things that stand fast in their visible form. Authentic liberation is the steadiness of being oriented toward that which appears in its visible form and which is the most unhidden in this appearing. Freedom exists only as the orientation that is structured in this way. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to say also from Plato's point of view, that freedom is the ability to be determined by what is the case. But what is more, this orientation as a turning toward alone fulfills the essence of paideia, of education, as a turning round. Thus, the fulfillment of the essence of education can be achieved only in the region of and on the basis of the most unhidden, that is the alethestaton, the truest, truth in the proper sense. The essence of education is grounded in the essence of truth. Now, this I'm not so sure about. The education, so at least has a bifold meaning in Plato. One is the education which occurs in the cave. And you might say that in addition to that, there's an education that is from the cave and to the forms, to speak metaphorically. But that occurs by way of conversation in the cave. So I think it's not that what Plato is saying is not that education, especially of more than one individual, takes place by moving from the cave, language, history, poetry, to the singular truth of things. Okay.
Even if that were an accurate description of education, it doesn't imply the reverse or the second part of what Heidegger's saying, right? Doesn't mean that the truth and education are co-determining.
Well, isn't he associating the degree of truth with the assent of the human being?
I think he's determining the possibility of the assent of human being with there being a truth. But that doesn't prove that the truth necessarily exists because there's education.
No, but he's saying that this notion of education begins from this, because he's saying there's the least amount of truth in the shadows. There's more in the things seen in the light of the fire behind the wall. And there's the most outside in the open. And he's suggesting that for Plato, that is education, and that therefore truth directly corresponds with level of education. And that becomes a paradigm. We have institutes of learning devoted to the truth.
Yeah, but the being institutes of learning is not a proof for the truth. And Heidegger seems pretty insistent here that they are co-determining.
Yep. Yeah, but but obviously Plato is not talking about the kind of education that Greek children ordinarily had. First, learn Homer, that's not, in book 7, after this discussion of the cave, he immediately lists 5 kinds of study that are paradigmatic for turning the soul away from the senses toward the being of things. And they're all the prelude to dialectic.
Yeah, I'm convinced. I'm following him as far as this is a pretty sweet analogy for education and how it works. I'm just not going as far as his claim that this means that their essences are somehow bound together.
That's because you work in education now.
Yes, maybe.
And you recognize that there is barely any relation left between these 2 aspects of human existence. So let's skip over the page. Now, stage 4 is the return of the person who's been freed and seen the truth back down into the cave. And then on the one hand, there are only a few lines of this in Plato's allegory. He says, he will be disorientated. If the cave dwellers could get hold of him, they put him to death. Now, that's a brief treatment, but in another respect, the whole of the Republic is an example of the return to the cave. The first word of the Republic is kate ben. I went down, I descended. And it's Socrates descending down to the Piraeus to talk to these young men about these things. So, and in other places he says, you've polished up your speech like a perfect statue, he says this to Glaucon at one point. And so he means, we human beings, this is how he says in the cave when he presents the analogy, those prisoners are like us, because we are like people who construct concepts which reflect within the horizon created by a language and a history, so that someone else within that horizon can understand it. And what we really want to intend to transmit to people might be the truth of things, but what we are doing is we're dealing with artifacts that reflect the truth in some way. So, yes, okay. Now, Heidegger has a different interpretation of this descent to the cave. And he says here, two factors are essential to the unhidden, to the truth. Not only does it in some way or other render accessible whatever appears and keep it revealed in its appearing, but it also constantly overcomes a hiddenness of the hidden. So the truth is a constant overcoming of forgetfulness, oblivion, and falsehood. And this is his poetic understanding of the truth, which sounds very much like the Hesiod passage and other passages from other early Greek poets, that the truth is always changing and hidden and spotted and so on. And the muses know how to tell lies like the truth, and they know how to tell the truth. But you, human being, who are not a muse, how do you tell the difference? Okay, so therefore, what being is mysterious to humans. In Homer, in order to get home, Menelaus is told, you have to go to a beach at a certain time, dressed in a seal skin, in order to catch the god Proteus, whose name, like proton, means the first thing. So the first thing is Proteus. And what will happen when you try and grab this god to extract the information of your route home is he will turn into all different other kinds of things, into giraffes, elephants, dragons, and so on. You have to cling on to him and eventually wear him out in order to learn something. And that's Homer saying something about what the changeable and unknowable essence of things is, possibly. I mean, anyway, it's in agreement with Heidegger's poetic understanding of truth. So two factors are essential to the unhidden. Not only does it in some way or other render accessible what appears, like an idea, and keep it revealed in its appearing, but it also, and this is Heidegger, it also constantly overcomes a hiddenness of the hidden. There's no stable truth, right? There's no atemporal truth. The unhidden must be torn away from a hiddenness. It must, in a sense, be stolen from hiddenness. And he uses the metaphor of actual, not stealing, but violence in the introduction to metaphysics. Originally for the Greeks, hiddenness, as an act of self-hiding, and this is, he's alluding here to this Heraclitan epigram that the truth tends to hide itself. The truth loves to hide itself. But that means, effort is required to uncover it. And also, if it tends to hide itself, it will reveal different parts of itself at different times. Originally for the Greeks, hiddenness as an act of self-hiding permeated the essence of being. And thus also, so essence doesn't mean the unchanging essence of a thing. It means how things are given differently. The essence of being, and thus also determined beings in their presentness and accessibility. That is, a being is present to you at a certain time, in a certain way, and you take that to be the truth forever, but it's not. It's what's been presented to you, given your orientation and given what is unhidden at this time. And that is why the Greek word for what the Romans call veritas and for what we call truth was distinguished by the alpha privative, the alpha meaning without the following. In this case, without forgetfulness, lethes, without oblivion. Truth originally means what has been wrested away from hiddenness. Truth is thus a wresting away in each case, in the form of a revealing. So we have two things. Being gives itself differently, and we still have to wrest from being what truth can be accessible for us. So it's not a subjective understanding of truth, but still it's not given to us the same in all times. The hiddenness can be of various kinds: closing off, hiding away, disguising, covering over, masking, dissembling. Now that's interesting, because the kind of activity he means in the fourth part of this story is when the person comes back in and it is in difference, in arguing or in conflict with the people inside. And it's not so clear that that's a closing off and a hiding away in this more metaphysical sense. I'll keep going for the moment. Since according to Plato's allegory, the supremely unhidden must be wrested from a base and stubborn hiding, for this reason, one's movement out of the cave into the open and into the light of day is, if I can get this to change pages without. Is a life and death struggle. So he's turning what is a struggle between the particular people in a political, historical circumstance against someone who knows the truth and is not impressed by the things that they're impressed by. He's turning that into a far more essential aspect of our openness to reality, into this struggle between what's hidden and unhidden for human beings per se.
Essential and necessary in the very kind of German sense of, if you have a process, then the necessary result of this process is the outcome, truth and education. It just seems like a very Hegelian understanding of how these two things are entangled.
I'm happy to let that stand. So we are on page 172. Okay, next time we have to be far more ruthless. Okay, I'll just read one more section in this lower paragraph. Now, the illustrative power in this section here of the allegory of the cave does not come from the image of the closedness of the subterranean vault and the imprisonment of people within its confines, nor does it come from the sight of the open space outside the cave. In other words, it's not from these different levels of the truth. For Plato, rather, the expository power behind the images of the allegory is concentrated on the role played by the fire, the fire's glow and the shadow it casts, the brightness of day, the sunlight and the sun. Everything depends on the shining forth of whatever appears and on making its visibility possible. Yeah, certainly unhiddenness is mentioned in its various stages, but it is considered simply in terms of how it makes whatever appears be accessible in its visible form, in the eidos, or the form. And in terms of how it makes this visible form as that which shows itself, the idea, be visible. So he is saying, Plato's understanding of the truth depends upon these static gradations in what's visible. And then he's going to say that's the truth of the being of things. And if that's the case, if there is a stable and unchanging eidos of something, then our intellectual effort is focused upon understanding that eidos as well as possible. And from Heidegger's point of view, that forgets the fact that there is a look of something present to us is part of an ongoing process, and therefore it imposes a character on something that it will not possess atemporally forever. And we've reached 8 o'clock with that. Okay, so next time, if you are having some time to read, please try to get to the end of the essay, because I'm going to try and I'll try and present an overall sum of the essay, and we'll read some portions from pages 173 to the end, and then try and give some justice to Heidegger's view. And then the following week we'll look at both again, Plato's Sunline Cave, and make some comparative attempts. So yeah, thanks again for turning up. I'm happy to stay on for, if anyone wants to discuss questions, because I've been zipping through very quickly without having any questions for the last few minutes. But otherwise, thank you very much for appearing again.
Thanks, Martin.
I've got a question, Martin. Just with the idea of the good that Plato presents as that thing that makes things understandable, or however we put it. What's his justification for calling that the good, or the idea of the good? I mean, at first sight, it wouldn't seem to have anything to do with goodness. It's just the thing that provides the truth to things, or gives us the power to know it. What's the actual justification for calling it the good?
In brief, I take it to be the fact that intelligibility is a good. The fact that things are knowable is not neutral, is not, because we're not neutral spectators. That initially, to be able to differentiate the different looks of things is of the highest value.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, Plato seems to want to argue that as act of knowing is amongst the highest aspects of us. And so the dispensation of intelligibility is the dispensation of what is our highest good.
Okay.
Could it be, Martin, that it's a claim that being is better than nothingness? So the sun is the source of everything. The sun is the source of everything. And he says the sun, take the sun as the source of everything as being the idea of the good. And we can have nothingness, or we can have, in a way, the opposite of nothingness is being, in a way. And being is superior to nothingness. And if it is superior, it is a good. Is that a plausible way of looking at it?
It's plausible. It's not one I can follow, because the good, the idea of good, he says, is beyond being. So it's not a being. So it's not non-being, Genesis being. The being of a thing is the form. What gives the truth and knowability to a thing is the idea of the good. That's not a thing.
And it's not a form either?
Yeah. So it's not a thing. I mean, the sun is a thing, of course. So like, this silly thing. I know time's up, but the sun, of course, without the sun, the solar system wouldn't exist, and so forth. But and equally, as a metaphor, without being, the beings can't exist. Without uppercase B being, the beings can't exist. But as purely as that which must be, and without it, there can't be things existing, then it makes sense to talk about being. That's
For you and for Heidegger, yes, but I don't think for Plato. Yeah. So yeah, an entirely plausible position to which many people agree, but that's not what Plato is saying. But I mean, that's something like what Heidegger's saying.
okay. Cheers.
Can I just ask Martin, just on that last point, probably very basically, where you're reading for Plato rather the expository power behind the images of the allegory, you know, if you take away the fire, is he saying there that if you take away the light, there is no truth? Like not even stages or layers of understanding? Is that what that's saying?
Yeah, without the fire and without the sun, there's no truth is visible.
Not even stages of, like, you can't increase in darkness. You can't, nothing is uncovered or nothing is discovered, maybe. Yeah. Sorry, I just want to make sure that was.
Yeah, I think that's what he's suggesting, that this is the condition for our having an intelligible world is not just our openness, but that it's intelligible.
So it doesn't, if there's no light, it doesn't matter if you're inside the cave or outside. There's no stage there, or, you know, differentiation. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Martin, I have a question. Is there any connection between the word the good, G-O-O-D, and the word God, G-O-D? Or is that just the way those two terms worked out in the English language?
I don't know. I'd have to look into that. I mean, God has similar roots to the Latin and Greek deos, theos. But I don't know about good. I have a funny feeling it might be more Old German than, but I'd have to check. And I'll have a look.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Will you be releasing the recordings of these lectures to us?
Yes, I thought I was. So I will send an email tomorrow. And did you get an email? Did I not send an email between the last class and this one? Because my intention is within a day of each discussion, I'll send the link to the video so that anyone who's not there can see it.
Okay, I think I got that for the first one, but maybe not for the second lecture.
Might have been my.
Yeah, that was, we got one for the first, but not.
Okay. Apologies. Because I did upload it, but as soon as I uploaded this one, I'll send an email to everyone.
Thank you.
But I was scratching to get through the reading anyway, so it's okay.
Yeah.
I didn't need extra material yet.
Yeah. No,
thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Brilliant once again, Martin. Much appreciated. Learning so much. It's awesome.
Thanks for your help.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, Martin?
Yeah.
So when Plato talks or refers to the form of the good, it seems like quite similar to Heidegger talking about being in the ways that they describe it. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I'm trying to work out like what the difference is. Is it more that for I was going to say that for Plato that is something stable and that stays the same or something like that, or but it seems like for being for Heidegger is always like given within the historical context. I don't know. But when I think about them in relation to each other, if I'm understanding them correctly, they seem more and more hard to get at and similar.
There are some very deep similarities, and sometimes for example, the sun goes around the earth, right? It doesn't light things up in the same way at all times, and so on. There are. I mean, in the Phaedrus, I think you might have been in the discussion we had. No, okay, sorry, but you see the beings through time, and that means differently at different times. Anyway, so there are these things that look, but there's a deep difference in that the focus for the being is the form, the intelligible character that is the center around which our discourse circles. And that's unchanging. As long as there are human beings, there's one human eidos. And Heidegger is saying, no, that is forgetting being itself, which is it's dispensing this light differently at different times, and therefore there is no stable form. And you're forgetting that, and you're not open to the things as they are, because you're trying to make them into unchanging categories. Yeah.
I guess what I'd ask, what seems interesting with Heidegger then, when he's saying it's unhiddenness, what are we uncovering then? Isn't there some sort of essence or something unchanging there that we are uncovering through that, dynamic process where truth arises according to him? So isn't there something that is static in a sense, or stable then?
Well, this is the difficulty. If there is a stable uncovering process, then doesn't that fall back into there being a permanent human nature? And I think this is something that he is self-consciously trying to avoid.
Yeah.
He's trying to talk about an emergence process of the intelligibility of things that isn't a stable, intelligible process.
Okay. And it seems like your view is that he's incorrect because there is some sort of stable, whatever's being uncovered is being uncovered from some sort of stability or something.
I think there are stable aspects to existence accessible to us, and that's why we're arguing about them. Because to argue means we've identified them. And
are they outside of ourselves? That's what I wonder, if it's just like,
yes,
if it's really just a psychological thing that we're asking about. Are we really just saying, oh, well, this is what it is like to be a human, and are we actually talking about the world? Sorry, my dishwasher's on. Or are we? Yeah, it doesn't seem like we're actually talking about the world. They're both just maybe making psychological points, or that's how it seems.
Yeah. If we've got both levels, the intelligible and the discursive, on the level of which all our science occurs, right? Formulae, proofs, arguments, demonstrations. Right? If we've then to be means to be intelligible, if something is in principle not intelligible, then we can't experience it. And then for us, it is not. Now, the partial exceptions to that are the whole, or the idea of the good, which at one point Plato says is something like the beginning of the whole or something. Because you can't capture the whole we have partial understandings of things because they depend upon there being something or being that we're talking about. But you can't grasp the whole in the same way, which is why we get images and myths of the whole of human existence. We have sciences that illuminate parts, and images and myths for the whole.
Yeah.
Because a science depends upon the unity of a thing. There are only, orangutans, and we start from orangutans or bacteria or whatever. But the whole has a different kind of unity, not accessible to a determinate science. Or I haven't put that very well, but
Yeah, I'm slightly lost now. Sorry. That is Plato saying that we have access to? We can't. I don't know. Like the form of the good is what enables us to get at some sort of access to the whole. It seems like with Heidegger, it's like talking about like finding out about what being is. It's like, I heard someone describe it as trying to bite your teeth. Like, it's just, you know, I mean, you can't do it. I don't know. I'm a bit lost, but yeah.
Because you can't develop an understanding that's discursive. You can prepare an orientation. He wants to prepare an orientation for a kind of revelation of the truth of things that we are closed off from because of our understanding of what truth is, our narrow understanding of what truth is. So that makes some sense.
But at the bottom is nothing, right? I mean, you seemed very hesitant to say the N word.
Yeah, well, so he identifies being with nothing quite correctly, because being itself cannot have any of the characteristics of any being, because then it is something. That which is the source of all beings is nothing, not a thing.
Haddon, did you just say it's like buying your teeth?
Biting.
Oh.
An entirely different problem.
Okay. Figure that one out.
Where do you hear that? That's really interesting way to put it.
Yeah.
I didn't make that up. I just heard it somewhere.
I believe you.
Who is it that somebody else has that expression, trying to climb out of your own skin? That was a German historian.
Sounds German.
Mm.
Well, nevertheless, all of these questions will be clarified, of course. And by the end, we'll be fundamentally wise in theory and practice.
Sweet. See you Thursday.
Yeah,
Great.
great. See you Thursday. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you. See ya.